Chapter 21. The Cardinal Deacon of St. Cosmas and St. Damian did it. The acts of the consistory, in so far as they related to the calumny against the Pope, duly appeared in the Times and the Globe and the New York Times as news which was fit to print. Innumerable other papers lifted them with acknowledgments. No comment was made. The collared puppy in the tube, and the spectacled person in the motor car, and the female with the loaf-colored hat at the bargain sale, forgot all about George Arthur Rose, paid no attention whatever to the Pope, and violently sat up on their hind legs regarding the supreme arbitrator. France and Russia emitted caricatures and howls, and prepared to invade Belgium and Sweden, with the intention of descending on Germany from three sides. Mrs. Crowe became conscious that she had lost rather than had gained by her connection with Jerry Sant. The English Catholics treated her as they are wont to treat converts after the first 3 months, and showed her the cold shoulder. The refutation of her latest calumny had made her look foolish, and something dirtier than foolish. She was mortified, she was angry with herself. And she naturally yearned to tear and mangle everybody else. She thought that the best thing which she could do would be to pose as a much-deceived woman, to break that disastrous connection with the Liblabs, and to return, if possible, to the status quo ante. So she went and fell upon Jerry, vituperating him for the accented failure of his schemes, for leading an innocent lady astray with his nastiness, and his pig-headed stupidity, and all that. She frankly told him that he had gone too far. The precious pair had words, and finally separated. Jerry remained at his hotel, dumb and dangerous, brooding. As for the lady, respectable mediocrity allured her by the prospect which it offered of a not unfamiliar obscurity, where she might try to piece together the shreds and tatters of her reputation. She had a little money left, and with economy, she would stay just a little longer. Who knew what might happen? One by one, cardinals received summons to the secret chamber. Their brains were picked and their opinions heard. Nevsky of the ashen pallor and the haunted eyes admitted that Poland might be happier as a constitutional monarchy and a member of a federation. Pushed to it, he promised to use all his influence to persuade. Mundo, cleanly, rotund and sparkling, spoke of Portugal's long and illustrious alliance with the Lord of the Sea. His compact vivid nation had no grievances. Grace looked silently vigorous, and praised the Monroe Doctrine. If only. The French cardinals chattered, were aghast, sobbed, were quite limp, and became picturesquely and dithyrambically resigned. Oh, they were so excellent, and so futile. Courtly pleaded age, infirmity. Circumstances had become more than he could manage. He had begun to think that he never had been anything but a decorative figurehead, that he never once had gripped the rudder of affairs since the Prince of Wales had been so, well, rude to him. He was old, he was garrulous, craving for greetings. He begged leave to go and end his days in the college which he had founded, if the Holy Father would but deign to relieve him of his archbishopric. Hadrian did deign, and summoned Talleyrand, to whom he said, "We are about to fulfill the ambition of your Eminency's life by preconizing you to the Archbishopric of Pimlico." The cardinal said something about being unworthy of the honor. "That of course," the pontiff responded, "but we place you there because you know or ought to know more of our mind than any man, and your task is to make that known to England. It at least never can be said, if you should err, that you erred through ignorance of our will. You have health, you have youth, you have a dominant presence. People will listen to you. Your danger and your fault are due to your national habit of suspicion. That can be conquered. Act up to your name, be frank, suspect no one, be ready to renounce, but your heart should tell you all that we would say. Now for Caerleon. Whom would you like to succeed your Eminency there?" Talleyrand said something about the right of the clergy to elect, but that was swept aside. Then he dwelled on the difficulty of finding a suitable priest who could speak the native language. "The last is not essential," said Hadrian, "you yourself cannot speak and cannot even learn that frightful jargon, although you are a native of the dreadful place, and After your habit of suspecting people, and, yes, it had better be said, a slight tendency to the habit of officious lying, the cardinal went purple. There. It is said and done with, you have had your lesson, and you know better now, after those things. The only reason why your episcopate has not been a very brilliant one is that you started with the false idea of the necessity of speaking that corrupt and obsolete dialect. But does not your holiness think that a foreigner? No, England is the dominant race, her language is the language of all her colonies. Why a triplet of little conquered countries should refuse to learn English, should be permitted to insist on their barbarous and unliterary languages, we never could understand. They are conquered countries, annexed to their conqueror. They have lost their national existence for centuries. They have no national existence, or any kind of existence apart from England. No. Nationality does not come into the question of your successor at all. That is where the Church of Christ differs from all religions. Rome can do, and does do, what no other ecclesiastical power durst do. Our predecessors sent an Italian to Canterbury, and even a Greek, Theodore, and we are sending a Celt to Pimlico. As for Curlian, do you remember John Jennifer, the priest of Cels? You do, he was a white man at Maryvale, and since? Good. He is Bishop of Curlian. He speaks the language, Holy Father, said Talleyrand, laughing. The merest accident. We selected him for his steadfast sturdy goodness under great difficulty at Maryvale. Oh, we remember. And the Pope's gaze went far away into the past. Cardinal Talleyrand mentioned that the Secretary of State desired to know whether His Holiness would require the services of the Patriarch of Byzantium at the present juncture. The Patriarch of Byzantium? It was thought that as he had negotiated with England during the reign of your Holiness's predecessors. Oh. Then, no. The services of the Patriarch of Byzantium are not required. When His Grace is not smirking in black drawing-rooms, or writing defamatory letters to duchesses. Defamatory letters, Holy Father. Yes, defamatory letters, such as this one which he wrote in 1890. The Pope got up, took off his episcopal ring, unlocked and dived into an alphabetical letter case, and handed a most ingeniously suggestive and lethific note to the cardinal. Well, when His Grace is not engaged in these disedifying pastimes, he has his patriarchate to attend to. In fact, unless he can see his way to become a resident patriarch in Byzantium within the month, he may look for a decree of deposition. The Supreme Pontiff's aspect was austere. Your Eminency will convey that response to Cardinal Ragna's obliging suggestion. Talleyrand made haste to kneel. Give me a blessing, Holy Father, and I will immediately proceed to my new see, whatever. Hadrian smiled. God bless you, son. But do not go yet. Pimlico has been in the hands of the Vicar General and the Coadjutor for years, and the Vicar Capitular can manage for the present. Stay here a little while. We shall need you. We shall not need you long. And Talleyrand went out from the presence, glad, yet grave. During a few days, questions and answers incessantly passed between the Vatican and Windsor Castle. Hadrian consulted sovereigns, discussed difficulties with statesmen. Baron de Bousert expressed the opinion that it would be futile to oppose the inevitable expansion of Germany. Signor Barconi himself officiated at an instrument installed in the apostolic antechamber, until he was carried away in nervous collapse. Hadrian envied him, and forced himself to resist temptation. He had much to do yet. Messages, study of maps, collation of MS notes, filled a score of each 24 hours. There was need of profound thought, so that the clairvoyant undazzled eye like a diver might reach the bottom of deep preserving thought. The 4 hours which remained chiefly were spent at the tomb of St. Peter in the Basilica. The arbitrator slept not at all in these days. He ate while at work. And only sought refreshment under the ice-cold tap in the bathroom. A squadron of English cruisers escorted a procession of royal yachts and battleships, which conveyed the Congress of Windsor to golden and immortal Rome. Then came the issue of the Epistle to the Princes, in which the apostle reiterated the evangelic counsels, predicating a scheme of utter self-sacrifice and non-resistance in imitation of the sweet reasonableness of Christ. This would mean, said he, the deliberate loosening and casting away of all conventions which bound society together. It was right, it was straight, it was the most direct road to heaven. But it was not in accordance with the human will, it would be called utopian and unconventional. And it would be derided more than followed, it would cause confusion inconceivable if it were attempted on the grand scale. Truth more quickly emerges from error than from confusion. Men, being what they are, i.e. bound to err, would be better for having their errancy guided. They would diverge from the road, but they should not leave it out of sight. And, properly guided, their movement at least could be made to tend towards the point desirable. Individuality so long had been suppressed, that its efforts required administration. Therefore the pontiff showed, as well as a conventional way of approaching that point desirable. He maintained the aristocratic and monarchic principle in strict integrity. A rebel was worse than the worst prince, and rebellion was worse than the worst government of the worst prince that hitherto had been. He proclaimed the anarchy of France and Russia to be a manifestation of diabolic ebullience, which ought to be restrained and stamped out by all right means, even the most stringent. France and Russia, having forfeited the right of being deemed capable of ruling themselves, henceforth must submit to be ruled. Satan finds mischief for idle hands to do. Occupation, and scope for occupation, alone will enable individuals and nations to work out their own salvation humanly speaking. Men must use themselves, for good or ill. Most human ills were caused by the lack of scope for energy. Sitting on, or screwing down, the safety valve invariably was fatal, a doctrine which he enforced on the attention and obedience of the clergy. These principles involved a rearrangement of various spheres of influence. The ruler of the world, Peter, the supreme arbitrator, decreed that the only nations, in which the facultas regendi survived in undiminished energy, were England, America, Japan, Germany, Italy. Some of the old monarchies, however, had not yet reached that point of decay when their extinction would become desirable. They were Norway, Sweden, Denmark. The German kingdoms and principalities and duchies, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Romania, Albania, Montenegro, the republics of Switzerland and San Marino. These were to be maintained as sovereign states and to preserve their national characters. Some also of the old monarchies, which had tolerated unmerited suppression, were to be given an opportunity of proving themselves worthy of corporate existence. These were Hungary, Bohemia, and Russian and German Poland. They were revived as kingdoms, and required to provide themselves with constitutions, after the manner of England, and to elect their respective monarchical dynasties. Switzerland and San Marino were confirmed as republics. The Sultan, at the instigation of England, his ally, would move his capital to Damascus, in order to concentrate the main force of Islam in Asia. Serbia was added to the Principality of Montenegro. Turkey in Europe and Bulgaria would become merged in the Kingdom of Greece. So far for particulars. Hadrian denounced, as bad and idle dreams, the plans of recent political schemers who had adumbrated ideas of a federation of the English-speaking and the Teutonic races. He dwelled upon the essential differences which divided Germany from America, and both from England. No blend was possible between the English and the Germans. And Americans were not qualified for bonds. Each one of the three was unique, and each would stand alone. Three such enormous powers must have each its own separate and singular existence and sphere of action. Three such spheres must be found, in which the three nations independently might thrive. It was room for independent development which must be sought out and assigned. He stated the case of the continent of Europe. Belgium had 228 inhabitants to the square kilometer, Holland, 160, Germany, 104, Austria, 87, France, 72, Russia was so sparsely populated that only a migration of 109,000 000 people from the rest of Europe would raise her to the European average. Hence, the Pope proclaimed the instauration of the Roman Empire, under two emperors, a northern emperor and a southern emperor, and confirmed the same to the King of Prussia and the King of Italy as representatives of the dynasties of Hohenzollern and Savoy respectively. He ordained that this instauration should not be deemed the ghost of the dead Roman Empire sitting crowned upon the grave thereof, but its legitimate heir and successor. Justified by the ancient virtues of the Romans, the beneficence of their rule, and the vigorous aspiration to well-doing which characterized their present representatives. The Northern Emperor William would nominate sovereign dynasties for Belgium and Holland. He might replace the present exiled monarchs on their respective thrones, or he might depose them and substitute members of his imperial family. He then would extend the borders of Germany, eastward to the Ural Mountains by the inclusion of Russia, westward to the English Channel and Bay of Biscay by the inclusion of France, southward to the Danube by the inclusion of Austria. At the same time, he would federate the constitutional monarchies of Norway and Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, Romania, and the Republic of Switzerland with the other sovereign states already under his suzerainty, while the southern Emperor Victor Emmanuel would federate the constitutional monarchies of Portugal, Spain, the extended Kingdom of Greece, the Principalities of Montenegro and Albania, and the Republic of San Marino, with the Kingdom of Italy, which last now was to include Italia Redenta. The frontier dividing the Northern Empire from the southern was to be formed by the Pyrenees, Alps, Danube, and Black Sea. The case of America was defined. The United States were to be increased by the inclusion of all the states and republics of the two Americas from the present northern frontier of the United States to Cape Horn. The Japanese Empire was authorized to annex Siberia. All Asia, except Siberia, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and all islands, were erected into 5 constitutional kingdoms, and added to the dominions of the King of England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. The title Emperor being antipathetic to the English race, on account of its primary significance, warlord, the official style of the Majesty of England, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, Asia, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and all islands, henceforth would be the ninefold king. Thus the supreme arbitrator provided the human race with scope and opportunity for energy. The provisions of the Epistle to the Princes were drawn up in the form of treaty dividing the world, till midnight, GT, of December 31st, NS. Of the year 2000 of the fructiferous incarnation of the Son of God, into the ninefold kingdom, the American Republic, the Japanese Empire and the Roman Empire. This treaty was signed, in the square of St. Peter's at Rome, by the Pontiff, the sovereigns and the presidents, on the festival of the Annunciation of Our Lady the Virgin. And the armies and navies of the signatories instantly set about the pacification of France and Russia by martial law. Chapter 22. April brought to Hadrian an experience of one of those periods of psychical disturbance which are incidental to the weakness of humanity, and inevitable by a man of his particular temper. Things lost their significance to him, persons lost their personality, events their importance, and time was not. He kept a straight face, and forced himself to courteous demeanor, but he was living in a world in which he felt himself to be just off the floor and floating. A world in which everything was strange and everybody was quite strange, a world where nobody and nothing mattered the least little bit. He had the sense at the beginning to include himself in secret behind guarded doors, and also to hold his tongue when his attendants were in the presence. He simply sat and wondered who he was, how he came there, who dressed him like that, and when, and decided that it did not matter. He nursed his cat, cooing and mewing and talking cat language in a most enjoyable manner. When the creature went away, it did not matter. He used to gaze at his cross by the hour together, planning combinations of lights and shades and backgrounds of bookbacks, placing the golden symbol there, and reveling in the supple splendor of the form, its dignity, its grace, the majestic youth of the face, noble and grave. He would close his eyes and learn the lovely planes and contours with delicate reverent touch. It pleased him to think that he had created a type of incarnate divinity, which neither was the Orpheus of the catacombs, nor the tragic mask of the Vernacle, nor the gross sexless indecencies wherewith pious Catholics in their churches insult the one among 10,000, the altogether lovely. That thought brought him back to space and time. Indignation at images at least 11 heads long, proportioned like female fashion plates, visaged like emasculate noodles whom you would slap in the face on sight. Simply for their tepid attenuate silliness, if you met them in the flesh, this drew down Hadrian to realities and life. He felt utterly exhausted. An exposition of sleep seized him. He was always drowsy, and would fall asleep in the daytime over the writing and reading which he put himself to do, in his armchair by the window, in his favorite seat by the old wall in the garden where he spent the vivid afternoons of spring. Only toward nightfall was he able to write that beautiful clear script of his, to bring any of his usual alertness to bear upon affairs. Even then that alertness was extraordinarily diluted. His intellect was nebulous, uncertain. He could not select saliencies, could not concentrate his thoughts, his constructive faculty was in abeyance, his imagination was in chains. He spent a long time over his scanty meals, chewing, reading, and remembering nothing which he read. In an inert perfunctory way, he blamed himself for waste of time, and continued to waste it. No doubt it was divine nature's will. Let it be understood that he was not slothful in the confessional sense of the word. He was merely lethargic, dulled, blunted, listless, eager for nothing, except to flee away and be at rest, From this stupor, he awoke in panic, as though nympholeptos, lymphatic, driven to frenzy by some unknown external agency. He became inspired with an appalling consciousness of the absolute necessity for instant active continuous exertion, if he were to continue alive upon this earth. He felt that, if he were to permit himself to relax for 1 instant, if for 1 instant he were to abdicate command of his physical forces, to let himself go, that instant would be his last. With this in his mind, he prepared for momentary unconscious lapses from violent activity. He posed with care, so that, if death should seize him unawares, he might not present a disedifying or untidy spectacle to the finders of his corpse. He carefully avoided postures from which, when he should be reft from the body, his form would fall indecorously. He did not trouble his confessor more often than twice a week as usual, but his one prayer, his incantation, always was on his lips: "Dear Jesus, be not to me a judge, but a Savior." He was losing hold of the world. Continually, through every hour of the day and night, his head rang with the reverberating boom, 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 boom of his strong heart's beating. The rhythm was maddening. He used to count the pulsations, wondering, after 14, whether he would be able to say 15, after 97. Whether he would be in Rome to say 98, expecting the sudden wrench of self from body, conjecturing the nature of that unique experience. Once, he put himself to the question, was he afraid? He answered, no, because he dared to hope, and, yes, because he had not been there before. But Socrates had said that death was our greatest possession on earth, and Seneca said that death was the best of the inventions of life, and Seneca's friend St. Paul said, to die is gain. On the whole, he was not afraid of death. But, he did not dare to go to sleep now. At night, he used to lie in bed, first on his right side, then at full length on his back with the pillow under his neck, and his hands crossed on the breast which had been tattooed with a cross when he was a boy, and his ankles crossed like a crusader, rigid, as he wished to lie in his coffin, and his brain active, counting physical pulsations, meditating on the future, scheming, planning, counting each breath, and waiting for the last, and death. Sometimes he wondered whether it was all worth while, whether it was in accordance with God's will that he should be so willful. He decided to risk an affirmative to that, on the ground of the existence of his will. He knew that he tried rightly to use it. He hoped for mercy on account of lapses. One point he determined. With all due respect to Socrates and Seneca, death came by sin, and sin was God's enemy, and God's friends must fight God's enemies to the bitter end. To relax was suicide, and suicide was sin. And, tired with conflict as he was, eager for rest and peace as he was, it certainly was not worth while to add to his tale of sin. It was not worth while to exchange tiresome earth for untiring hell, to lose, what Petrarch calls, the splendor of the angelic smile. He had no steel in his possession except safety razors, knives and scissors he had abolished long ago, and now he had light strong gratings fixed to all his windows. He would not go into temptation. I am fawned upon by hope. Ah, would that she had a voice which I could understand, a voice like that of a herald, that I might not be agitated by distracting thought. He said to himself in the words of Electra at the tomb of Agamemnon. Had he been trained in boyhood at a public school, in adolescence at an university, had his lines been cast in service, he would not have had to put so severe restraint upon himself. The occasion would not have arisen. A simple and perhaps a stolid character would have been formed of his temper, potent and brilliant enough to distinguish him from the mob, but incapable of hypersensation. Instead, his frightfully self-concentrated and lonely life, denied the ordinary opportunities of action, had developed this heartrending complexity, had trained him in mental gymnastics to a degree of excellence which was inhuman, abominable, in the first intention of the words. In its facile flexible solid dexterity. He was not restrained by any sense whatever of modesty or of decorum. He had no sense of those things. He knew it, and regretted it. He was himself. He distrusted that self, rejoiced in it, and determined to deal well and righteously with it. Guido Cabelli, at length summoned, found him positively furious with the pain of physical and intellectual struggles. The physician exhibited pot. Brom, tincture valerian. Am, tincture zinzal, sp. Chloroff, aq, menthe. Pip, once every 3 hours. It made the pontiff conscious that he stank like a male cat in early summer, but he heard no more boom-booming in his ears. It strung up his nervous system for the time. He put on his pontifical mask, and addressed himself from the ideal to the real. He put the affairs of nations on one side. They, the nations, all were tumbling over one another in their eagerness to rearrange themselves upon the pattern which he had devised for them. If he adopted the Pythagorean role of an uninterested spectator, either he would be annoyed by something ugly or something silly, or he would have a chance of glorifying himself on account of some success. And he wished to do otherwise than that. In this world, God and his angels only may be spectators. The affairs of religion, as far as he could see, amounted to the service of others and the cultivation of personal holiness, the correspondence with divine love. Someone had told him that, yes, Talacrin in confession, of course, that the key to all his difficulties, present and to come, was love. That was all very pretty and theological on the part of the bishop, the Cardinal Archbishop, but it was the baby who had taught him the secret of the method. He really would keep his troubles to himself. His office was the office of leader and exemplar. Nothing must interfere. He put himself to review the first year of his pontificate, and a black enough tale it seemed to him. Without surprise, without emotion, he noted the blurs of impatience, pride, humanity. Retrospection was the most wearisome, most fatuous banality. Onward. Leader and exemplar. One thing was clear. He must come down among the led and following. He must be seen of men. And he was not seen. No. Peculiar personal preference kept him apart, mysterious. He rather enjoyed, not the being misunderstood but, the not being understood. And, at the same time, he had been doing a lot of people the gross injustice of crediting them with the possession of intelligence similar to his own, of perspicacity equal to his own, of the ability to keep up with his rapid pace and abrupt maneuvers. That was unrighteous. No doubt it had been all very fine and noble and so forth to sit down silent under calumny, for example. One could afford to do that when one was innocent. But, when millions of people, to give the devils their due, actually wanted to believe one innocent, and would be grieved and perhaps injured because the opportunity to believe innocence was withheld, was it righteous to refuse to condescend? No, such a pose was mere pride. The servant of the servants of God must not fear to soil the whiteness of his robe in any kind of ordure. Also, to save others was the best way of retrieving oneself. He sent for the nearest cardinals. Ragna, Saviali, Semfil, Stirling, Talleyrand, Carvale, Van Christen, Gentillato, Leighton, Whitehead, responded to the summons. Hadrian received them in the throne room, but without formality, and contrived to give them an easy and genial greeting. They thought him to be looking seriously ill. There was the dead whiteness of a gardenia in the hue of his face and hands, his reddish-brown hair was going grey over the left ear, his intense and rigid mask was the sign of pain. His whole aspect also was diaphanous, wasted. But his manner was vivid, he was not inaccessible. Their eminencies gave him their attention, and wondered what he was going to bring out of the dispatch box by his side. He was extremely glad to see the Secretary of State, for he knew how antipathetic he was to that one. And now he was going to try to give him satisfaction. At least it should not be his fault if Ragna's ordinary attitude of discreet and convulsive brutality remained unmitigated. Lord Cardinals, the Supreme Pontiff said, it has occurred to us that ye have many things to say, that there be many things which ye desire to know. We, on our part, are ready to hear. And we are willing to respond to questions. Questions instantly were born in each man's brain. Ragna was the first to deliver himself of his. Holiness, will you answer a question about the epistle to the princes? Yes. Ragna collected himself. I am curious to know why the rights of France in Egypt were not even named. I can see that the very nature of your Holiness's counsels demanded that Africa as a whole should pass to England, but I cannot understand why Germany, in taking over France, should not also have taken over the condominium of Egypt. Why did that fall to England, and why did Germany consent to its falling to England? Hadrian made an effort to conquer his natural incapacity for coming near a subject at the first attempt, and put himself to be concise. Your Eminency knows that since, we forget the exact date, but since a very short time ago, no international obligations have existed which could restrain Egypt from legitimate attempts at emancipation. Nothing but Ottoman firmans held her. Very well. We discovered that when the King of England and the Sultan, last October, made alliance, the latter issued a firman in which England was named Protector of Egypt. Then, the speaker slightly smiled, when the task of arbitration was submitted to us, we found that the German colonies in Africa, not only did not pay their way but, required a yearly subsidy of £1,500,000. And therefore, taking one thing with another, we arranged to give Germany sufficient employment for a century nearer home. She promptly recognized that megli e fringuello in man, che tordo in frasca. The fact is that she was only too glad to be rid of her own parasitic colonies, which had severed their connection from the parent stem, and derived their nutriment from other states, while the colonies of France which were epiphytic, having no existence apart from the source from which they sprang, were wiped out, as French colonies, when France was wiped out. And no doubt Germany, in her pretty Gothic way, was in such a desperate hurry to grab France, that she forgot all about Egypt. D'ye know they say she's going to call her conquest Gallia again? Semfil put in with a sniff. And now I'll ask a question. Holy Father, may I smoke? But smoke. Hadrian assented with pleasure, and held out his own hand for a cigarette. Some of the others did likewise, and the gear began to run much more easily. Van Christen expressed joy that the Germans were not to have chances of doing more monkey business on the Erechtheion and the Acropolis at Athens. Yes, Ragna meditatively continued, I suppose I ought to have understood all that. But now, Holiness, there's another thing. Why did the Sultan consent to evacuate Europe? Simply because, with all the examples which he has had lately, he goes in mortal terror of assassination. He has managed to persuade himself that he only can be warranted against that, as long as he is under the aegis of England. Well, seeing England and Turkey allied, we moved England and England moved Ismail. The former had sense, the latter, sentiment. But Ismail really is not half bad, in fact he's rather decent. If we only had another dear charming childlike naked Christian like blessed brother Francis. What? Said Carvale with animation. He happened to have noted that, when Hadrian rioted in superlatives, it meant no more than positives, but, when he negligently drawled comparatives, not half bad, or, rather decent. The ultimate of praise was signified. What? The cardinal repeated. We would send him to give points to Ismail's mullahs and dervishes. Saint Francis has innumerable sons, Holiness, Saviali put in. And we only know one who in the slightest degree resembles his father, the Pope responded, waving away the subject. One would like to know, said Sterling, whether your Holiness is not really of the opinion that the epistle to the princes was perhaps a trifle too sentimental and... Sentimental? Yes. The ruler, who rules sentiment out of his calculations, ignores one of the most potent forces in human affairs. Too sentimental? No. And what else was your eminency about to say, a trifle too sentimental and... One would have said perhaps a trifle too arbitrary. Dear man, the Pope gleefully began. But Ragna interrupted, nothing of the kind. That particular epistle was replete with pontifical dignity, it was the finest thing. Hadrian stopped him. We were about to remind Cardinal Sterling that when the ruler of the world geographically rules the world, he is accustomed to do his ruling with a ruler. Our predecessor Alexander VI used a ruler on a celebrated occasion on the Atlantic Ocean. Everybody burst out laughing, laughed for a few moments, and returned to a serious demeanor. There was a question, an important question, which sat upon all tongues, wing-preened, ready to fly. But His Holiness already had refused to discuss it. Those, who had tried to persuade, so seriously had been hurt by his icy reticence or by his blunt aloofness, that no one now was temerarious enough to attempt the reopening of so unsavory and so personal a matter, except upon explicit invitation. Knowing what he did of men, Hadrian had expected hesitation, but, seeing that his purpose was likely to fail of completion, and, being determined that it should not fail, he slowly and significantly drew off the pontifical ring from his first finger, and put it in his pocket. Gentlemen, he said with quite a change of manner, some of you would like to put George Arthur Rose to the question? They would indeed. They would whatever. They would like it so much that they all spoke in unison. The sum of their words amounted to a request that George Arthur Rose would give them some sort of statement concerning newspaper calumnies. Some sort of statement by way of support to their contention that he had been grossly wronged and misrepresented. It was George the Degladiator who responded. He seemed to step down into the arena, naked, lithe, agile, with bright open eyes, and ready to fight for life. Very well, he said, I will give that statement to you, but understand that I will not defend myself in the newspapers. If I were a layman, should have whipped in a writ for libel, and have given my damages to Nazareth House. I should have preferred to trust my reputation rather to an English judge and jury, than to the nameless editors of Erse or radical newspapers. Fancy having one's letters edited by the Catholic Hour, for example, fancy having one's letters, which are one's defense, nefariously garbled by a nameless creature who is one's prosecutor. And one's judge, and one's jury, all in one. However, not being a layman, I cannot go to law, and I will not condescend to have dealings with those newspapers. Understand also, that I tell you what I am about to tell you, not because I have been provoked, abused, calumniated, traduced, assailed with insinuation, innuendo, mispresentation, lies, not because my life has been held up to ridicule, and to most inferior contempt, not because the most preposterous stories to my detriment have been invented, hawked about, believed. No. Please understand that I am not going to speak in my own defense, even to you. I personally and of predilection, can be indifferent to opinions. But officially I must correct error. So I will give you some information. You may take it, or leave it, believe it or disbelieve it. You shall have as photographic a picture as I can give you of my life, and of the majestic immobility by which you clergy tire out, assassinate a man's body, perhaps his soul. You are free to use it or abuse it. When I shall have finished speaking, I never will return to this subject. Of course we shall believe what you say, Semphil rather nervously intercalated. I'm sure we believe it unsaid. We take it as said, you know. But if you could see your way to give us details, say on half a dozen points, that would be quite enough. The Daily Anagraph has not apologized for its latest slander, Carvale put in. Why should it? George inquired. Well, I sent an authenticated account of what happened in the last consistory. The other papers printed it, and I should have thought the least the Daily Anagraph could have done would be. Carvale, you're making a mistake. The Daily Anagraph has no personal grudge against me, although the last editor had, because I once innocently asked him whether historical accuracy came within the scope of a radical periodical. That was years ago, at the time of the second Dreyfus case. I know that he was furious. Because Bertram Blighter, the novel man, told me that that editor in revenge was going to put me on the newspaper blacklist, whatever that may be. No, it is not a personal matter, a matter in which an apology is customary. It's simply an example of the ethics of commercial journalism. The man wanted to increase the sale of his paper. I happened by chance to be before the world just then. And he took the liberty of increasing his circulation at my expense. Actually, that is all. You can't, at least I don't, expect an editor, who is capable of doing such a thing, to apologize for doing it. The case of the other papers is verisimilar, except of course the Catholic Hour. That simply exists on sycophanty by sycophants for sycophantophagists, as Semphil knows. Yes, I know, said Semphil. And I don't allow the thing to enter my house. But the others, in their case it's not lurid malignance, but legal malfeasance. Did you say that they apologized? No. None of those, which printed the calumnies, apologized. They just kept silence. But all the respectable papers, which had not calumniated you, printed my refutation of the Daily Anagraph. George made a gesture of scorn, of satisfaction, of dismissal. Then the Pope is clear, he said. Now I will try to tell you, as briefly as possible, what you want to know about the other person. He produced a sheaf of newspaper cuts. He was in such a white rage at having to do what he was about to do, that he wreaked his anger on those who listened to him, piercingly eyeing them. Speaking with swift fury as one would speak to foes. The Catholic Hour states that in 1886 I was under an undermaster at Grandhome School, that I had to leave my mastership because I became Catholic. That is true in substance and absolutely false in connotation. I was an undermaster, but as I also had charge of the schoolhouse, I was called the housemaster. You also perhaps may be aware that there is only one headmaster in a school, and that all the rest are undermasters. But, when slander is your object, undermaster is a nice disgraceful dab of mud to sling at your victim for a beginning. Well, I resigned my housemastership of my own free and unaided will for the reason alleged, and I have yet to learn that the becoming Catholic is an extraordinarily slimy deed. Further, note this, far from my resignation being the dishonorable affair which the Catholic Hour implies. The headmaster of Grandhome School remained my dear and intimate and honored friend through thick and thin, for more than 20 years, and is my only dear and intimate friend at this moment. Semphil and Carvale looked up, and then down. Sterling looked down, down. Van Christen looked up. The others, anywhere. Talleyrand looked annoyed. The taunt was flung out. And the flying voice went on. The Catholic hour thus casts its diatribe in a key of depreciation. Next, I am said to have gone to a school for outcasts, to have quarreled with the 2 priest chaplains, and presently to have been again out. The idea being to infer evil, it is rather cleverly done in that statement of the case. But here are the facts. The school perhaps might be called a school for outcasts. But I, a young inexperienced Catholic of 6 months, was lured by innumerable false pretenses, on the part of the eccentric party who offered me the post, to accept what he called the headmastership of a cathedral choir school. He did not tell me that he was forcing the establishment on the bishop of the diocese, nor that the headmastership had been refused by several distinguished priests simply on account of the impossible conditions. I bought my experience. That I quarreled with the chaplains is quite true. I did not quarrel effectually though. They were a Belgian and a Frenchman. They drank themselves drunk on beer, out of decanters, chased each other round the refectory tables in a tipsy fight, defied my authority and compelled the ragamuffins of the school to do the same. I naturally resigned that post as quickly as possible. Then follows a pseudo-history of the beginning of my ecclesiastical career at Maryvale. Talleyrand knows all about that, and can tell you at your leisure. Afterwards, I came across a certain Pictish laird, and was maintained by him for 3 or 4 months. And I know all about that. Semphil interrupted, you gave a great deal more than you got. The fallacies connected with my career at and expulsion from St. Andrew's College are known? Thoroughly, assented Semphil, Talleyrand, and Carvale in a breath. The statement that I contracted large debts there. What about those debts? Ragna asked. Carvale told him. They all were contracted under the personal supervision of the vice-rector. They were quite insignificant. Besides that, they would not have been contracted but for the promise of Archbishop Smithson and the advice of Canon Dugdale. And the advice of me, Semphil added in a low tone. Oh, you at length acknowledge it? George fiercely thrust at him. Yes, I acknowledge it. Well then, we're quits now, George quietly and mysteriously mewed. One confesses that the question of the pseudonym interests one, Sterling judicially said. I had half a dozen. You see, when I was kicked out from college, without a farthing or a friend at hand, I literally became an adventurer. Thank God who gave me the pluck to face my adventures. I was obliged to live by my wits. Thank God again who gave me wits to live by. Cardinal Leyden was standing up, blinking and blushing with indignation which distorted his honest placid features. Holy Father, don't say another word. He twitched round towards his fellow collegians. How can you torture the man so, he cried. Can't you see what you're doing, racking the poor soul like this, pulling him in little pieces all over again? Shame on ye, Holy Father, don't say another word. Oh, if I had only known! Cried Van Christen. You did. I told you myself, and you didn't believe me. George fulminated. The youngest cardinal wept into his handkerchief, shaking with sobs. George neither saw nor noted anyone. He was glaring like a python. Demurrers to Leyden's remarks arose. No one wanted to rack anybody. Questions had been invited. Of course no one believed. But it would be so much more satisfactory, Ragna added. George sat violently still in his chair while they talked, let them talk, and prepared to resume. If your holiness would condescend, Carvale began. There is no holiness here, George interrupted, in that cold white candent voice which was more caustic than silver nitrate and more thrilling than a scream. If you would do us the favor of just noticing a few heads. As you please, George chucked at him, agree among yourselves as to those heads. And you shall have bodies and limbs and fingernails and teeth to fit them. Their eminencies began agreeing. George meanwhile went into the secret chamber for 10 minutes or so, and returned with his cat on his neck, and his own tobacco pouch. He was beginning a cigarette. And his gait was the gait of a challenged lion. Sterling presented him with a penciled slip of paper. He read aloud: pseudonym, begging letters, debts, luxurious living, idleness, false pretenses as to means and position. I think it right to say that I myself am perfectly satisfied on all those points, said Semphil. I've read the calumnies, and I call them dastardly calumnies, in the light of my own knowledge of the facts. And I can only say that the worst thing which they've alleged against you is that you've been used to go about bilking landlords. All the rest is excusable, not to say harmless. Gracious heavens! George exclaimed in a rictus of rage. Do you suppose that a man of my description goes about bilking landlords for the sake of the fun of the thing? It's no such deliriously jolly work, I can tell you. However, I've never bilked any landlords, if that's what you want to know. Never. They saw that I worked like 19 galley slaves. And they offered to trust me. I voluminously explained my exact position and prospects to them. I was foolish enough to believe that you Catholics would keep your promises and pay me for the work which I did at your orders. So I accepted credit. I wish I had died. When at length I was defrauded, legally, mind. For, as my employers were Catholics and sometimes priests, I trusted to their honor, and obtained no stamped agreement, when I was defrauded of my wages. My landlords lost patience, poor things, I don't blame them, harried me, reproached me, at length turned me out, and so prevented me from paying them. I dug myself out of the gutter with these bare hands again and again, and started anew to earn enough to pay my debts. Debts! They never were off my chest for 20 years, no matter what these vile liars say. Debts! They say that I incurred them for luxurious living, unjustifiably. His passionate voice subsided, he became frightfully cool and tense and terse, analytical, quite merciless to himself. Their eminencies never before had seen a surgical knife at work in a human heart and brain. They sat all vigilant and attentive, as self-dissection proceeded. They say that I gorged myself with sumptuous banquets at grand hotels. Once, after several days' absolute starvation, I got a long-earned guinea. And I went and had an omelette and a bed at a place which called itself a grand hotel. It wasn't particularly grand in the ordinary sense of the term. And my entertainment there cost me no more than it would have cost me elsewhere, and it was infinitely cleaner and tastier. They say that I ate daintily, and had elaborate dishes made from a cookery book of my own. The recipes, there may have been a score of them, were cut out of a penny weekly, current among the working classes. The dishes were lentils, carrots, anything that was cheapest, cleanest, easiest, and most filling, nourishing, at the price. Each dish cost something under a penny, and I sometimes had one each day. As I was living on credit, I tried to injure no one but myself. That's the story of my luxurious living. Let me add though that I was extravagant, in proportion to my means, in one thing. Whenever I earned a little bit, I reserved some of it for apparatus conducing to personal cleanliness, soap, baths, tooth things, and so on. I'm not a bit ashamed of that. Why did I use credit? Because it was offered, because I hoped, because, that I did not abuse it. You may see, actually see, by my style of living, here are the receipted bills. And by the number and quantity and quality of the works of my hands. I never was idle. I worked at one thing after another. The Catholic hour admits my skill, and mispresents that as a crime. At the same time, I myself don't claim my indefatigability as a virtue. Nothing of the kind. It's something lower than that. It's comical to say it, but my indefatigability was nothing but a purely selfish pose, put on solely to make philanthropists look unspeakably silly. To give the lie direct to all their idiotic iniquitous shibboleths. It wasn't that I couldn't stop working, but that I wouldn't. The fact is that I long, I burn, I yearn, I thirst, I most earnestly desire, to do absolutely nothing. I am so tired. I have such a genius for elaborate repose. But convention always alleges idleness, or drunkenness, or lechery, or luxury, to be the causa causans of scoundrelism and of poverty. That's a specimen of the idola specus, the systematizing spirit which damns half the world. People never stop to think that there may be other causes, that men of parts become rakes, or scoundrels, or paupers, for lack of opportunity to live decently and cleanly. Look at François Villon, and Christopher Marlowe, and Sir Richard Steele, and Leo di Giovanni, and heaps of others. Well, I resolutely determined that you never righteously should allege those things of me. Simply to deprive you of that excuse for your failure to do your duty to your neighbor, simply to deprive you of the chance of classifying me among the ruck which your neglect has made, I courted semi-starvation and starvation. I scrupulously avoided drink, I hardly ever even spoke civilly to a woman. And I labored like a driven slave. No, I never was idle. But I was a most abject fool. I used to think that this diligent ascetic life eventually would pay me best. I made the mistake of omitting to give its due importance to the word own, in the adage, virtue is its own reward. I had no other reward, except my unwillingly cultivated but altogether undeniable virtue. A diabolic brute once said to me, if I had your brains I would be earning 1,000 a year. I replied, take them, tell me what to do, give me orders, and I implicitly will obey you. Then, take that 1,000 a year, and give me 200, and I'll bless you all my days. He said nothing. And he did nothing. He was just a fatuous liar. I mocked him, caught him stealing my correspondence, there is his written confession. And, he wrote these anonymous calumnies in long-cherished revenge. The dreadful lambent voice flickered for a moment, and more rapidly flashed on. I repeat, I never was idle. I did work after work. I designed furniture, and fire irons. I delineated saints and seraphim, and sinners, chiefly the former, a series of rather interesting and polyonymous devils in a period of desperate revolt. I slaved as a professional photographer. Making, from French prints, a set of negatives for lantern slides of the Holy Land which were advertised as being from original negatives, messing about, the Catholic Hour elegantly denominates that portion of my purgatory. Well, I admit it was messy, and insanitary within the meaning of the act too, but then you see I was working for a Catholic. I did journalism, reported inquests for 18 pence. I wrote for magazines. I wrote books. I invented a score of things. Experts used to tell me that there was a fortune waiting for me in these inventions, that any capitalist would help me to exploit them. They were small people themselves, these experts, small, in that they were not obliged to pay income tax, they had no capital to invest, but they recommended me, and advised me to apply to lots of people who had, gave me their names and addresses, dictated the letters of application which I wrote. I trusted them, for they were businessmen, and I knew that I was not of that species. I quieted my repugnance. And I laid invention after invention, scheme after scheme, work after work, before capitalist after capitalist. I was assured that it was correct to do so. I despised and detested myself for doing it. I scoured the round world for a patron. These were my begging letters. At that time I was totally ignorant of the fact that there are thousands of people who live by inviting patronage. And that most of them really have nothing to be patronized, while the rest are cranks. I knew that I had done such and such a new thing, that I had exhausted myself and my resources in doing it, that my deed was approved by specialists who thoroughly knew the subject. I was very ashamed to ask for help to make my invention profitable, but I was quite honest, generous. I always offered a share in the profits, always. I did not ask for, and I did not expect, something for nothing. I had done so much. And I wanted so little, but I did want that little, for my creditors, for giving ease to some slaves of my acquaintance. I was a fool, a sanguine ignorant abject fool. I never learned by experience. I still kept on. A haggard shabby shy priestly-visaged individual, such as I was, could not hope to win the confidence of men who daily were approached by splendid plausible cadgers. My requests were too diffident, too modest. I made the mistake of appealing to brains rather than to bowels, to reason rather than to sentiment. I wanted hundreds, or thousands, say 2, others wanted and got tens and hundreds of thousands. A cotton waste merchant could not risk 1,500 on my work, although he liked me personally and said that he believed in the value of my inventions, but, at the same time, he cheerfully lost 12,000 in a scheme for ventilated boots. I myself was wearing ventilated boots, then, but the ventilated boot man wore resplendent patent leather. Cardinals' secretaries could live at the rate of £2,290 a year and borrow £3,060, on a salary of £200 a year. And they could become bankrupt for £4,120 with £180 worth of assets. But I could not get my due from that man, one of whose secretaries wrote his business to me on the franked notepaper of the late Queen of England's treasury, while the other, the bankrupt, gave me a winter of starvation, because his lord had altered his mind, quoth he, about the job on which I was working, and had determined to put his money into a cathedral. No. I never accomplished the whole art and mystery of mendicity. I perfectly could see what was required of him who would be a successful swindler. I was not that one. I was playing another kind of game, unfortunately an honest one. Take that, unfortunately, for irony, please. I mean, but you perfectly know what I mean, I made nothing of my inventions. By degrees, I had the mortification of seeing others arrive at the discovery which I had made years before. They contrived to turn it into gold and fame. That way, one after another of my inventions became null to me. I think I am right in saying that there are only 4 remaining at the present moment. Finance them now? Engage and trade like a monk or a nun? No. No. I shall give them to, that doesn't matter. It shall be done today, idle? Idle? When I think of all the violently fatuous frantic excellent things I've done in the course of my struggles for an honest living, Alf, it makes me sick. Oh yes, I have been helped. God forgive me for bedaubing myself with that indelible blur. I had not the courage to sit down and fold my hands and die. A brute once said that he supposed that I looked upon the world as mine oyster. I did not. I worked, and I wanted my wages. When they were withheld, people encouraged me to hope on, and offered me a guinea for the present. I took the filthy guinea. God forgive me for becoming so degraded. Not because I wanted to take it, but because they said that they would be so pained at my refusal. But one can't pay all one's debts, and lead a godly righteous sober life forever after on a guinea. I was offered help, but help in teaspoonfuls, just enough to keep me alive and chained in the mire, never enough to enable me to raise myself out of it. I asked for work, and they gave me a guinea, and a tacit request to go and agonize elsewhere. My weakness, my fault was that I did not die murdered at Maryvale, at St. Andrew's College. The normal man, treated as I was ill-treated, would have made no bones whatever about doing so. But I was abnormal. I took help, when it was offered gently. I'm thankful to say that I flung it back when it was offered charitably, as the Bishop of Cloughton offered it, and Monsignor, you know whom I mean, Talleyrand, and John Newcastle of the Weekly Tabule. I'll tell you about the last. He said that, being anxious to do me a good turn, he had deposited £10 with a printer-man, who would be a kind friend to me, and would consult me as to how that sum could be expended in procuring permanent employment for me. I took 7 specimens of my handicraft to that printer-man. He admired them, offered me a loan of £5 on their security. With that, I fulfilled a temporary engagement. Then I consulted the printer-man, the kind friend. He proposed to give me a new suit of clothes. I was to do without shirts or socks, to accept my services at no salary, and to teach me the business of a printer's reader for 3 months. And, then, to recommend me for a situation as reader to some other printer. But, I said, why waste 3 months in learning a new trade when I already had 4 trades at my fingers' ends? But, I said, what was I to live on during those 3 months? But, I said, what certainty was there at the end of those 3 months? But, he said, that he would have none of my lip, for he knew all my capers, and he bade me begone and take away my drawings. Those were ruined, he had let them lie on his dirty office floor for months. Oh, I admit that I have been helped, quite brutally and quite uselessly. Helped? Yes. Once, when they told me at the hospital that I was on the verge of a nervous collapse, a Jesuit offered to help me. He would procure my admission to a certain house of rest, if I would consent to go there. By the mercy of God I remembered that it was a licensed madhouse, where they imprisoned you by force and tortured you. Fact. There had been a fearful disclosure of their methods in the PMG. Well, I refused to go. Rather than add that brand to what I had incurred through being Catholic, I made an effort of will, and contrived to escape that danger, contrived to recover my nerves. And I continued my battle. Regarding my pseudonyms, my numerous pseudonyms, think of this, I was a tonsured clerk, intending to persist in my divine vocation, but forced for a time to engage in secular pursuits both to earn my living and to pay my debts. I had a shuddering repugnance from associating my name, the name by which I certainly some day should be known in the priesthood, with these secular pursuits. I think that was rather absurd, but I am quite sure that it was not dishonorable. However, for that reason I adopted pseudonyms. I took advice about adopting them, for, in those days, I used to take advice about everything, not being man enough to act upon my own responsibility. Also, the idea of using pseudonyms was suggested to me, and the first one was selected for me. As time went on, and Catholic malfeasance drove me from one trade to another, for you know, Talleyrand, Carvale, Semphil, Sterling, that 2 excellent priests declared in so many words that they would prevent me from ever earning a living, legal assassination. You see, definitely was contemplated. I say, as Catholic malfeasance drove me from one trade, I invented another, and another. And I carried on each of these under a separate pseudonym. In fact, I split up my personality. As Rose I was a tonsured clerk, as King Clement, I wrote and painted and photographed, as Austin White, I designed decorations, as Francis Engel, I did journalism. There were 4 of me at least. I always have thought it so inexplicable that none of the authorities, you, Talleyrand, with your pretended confidence in me and your majestic immobility towards me, that none of you ever realized the tremendous amount of energy which was being expended, misdirected, if you like. Certainly no one of you ever made a practical attempt to direct that energy. I was like a wild colt careering round and round a large meadow. You all looked on and sneered, erratic. Of course I was erratic, for you all did your very best, by stolidity, hints, insinuations, commands, to create obstacles over which I had to jump, through which I had to tear away. And there was no one to bit and bridle me, to ride me, and to share his couch with me. And of course my pseudonymity has been misunderstood by the stupid, as well as mispresented by the invidious. Most people have only half developed their single personalities. That a man should split his into 4 and more, and should develop each separately and perfectly, was so abnormal that many normals failed to understand it. So when false pretenses and similar shibboleths were shrieked, they also took alarm and howled. But there were no false pretenses. I told my name to everyone whom it concerned. I am not the only person who has traded under pseudonyms or technicrims. Take, for example, the man whose shop I am said to have offered to buy. He himself used a trade name. He begged for my acquaintance when I was openly living as a tonsured clerk, about a couple of years before my first pseudonym even was thought of. Take, for another example, those priests, Fr. Alec of Beale, and the Order of Divine Love, who are alleged to have charitably maintained me. By the way, they never did that. They always were paid for my entertainment, in hard coin, and their own price, always. And the Fathers of Divine Love refused me shelter for one night in 1892 at the very time when they are said to have charitably maintained me. They did suggest a common lodging-house at 4d, though, and I flung back the suggestion in their faces and walked the streets all night. But all these people knew all about me and my pseudonyms. In fact, the very priest who suggested the common lodging-house was the man on whose advice I adopted my first pseudonym. It was invented by an old lady who chose to call herself my grandmother. She was that priest's patron and penitent. It was approved by him and adopted by me. And there you have the blind and naked truth on that point. It now is pretended that King Clement was a Jesuitical Machiavellian device of mine, implying royalty, dominions, wealth, and interminable nonsense. I think that the pretension is due to malice and imbecility. It is malignant now, but I firmly believe that it began by being imbecile. I confess that the name, taken together with my domineering manner, my pedantic diction, my austere and, shall I say, exclusive habit, was liable to misconstruction by the low-course half-educated uncultured boors among whom I lived. It's an example of the idolophore, the strange power of words and phrases over the mind. I think it really was believed, in some vague way, that I was an exiled sovereign or some rot of that sort. I believe that I perceived it, and laughed to myself about it. But I did my best to disabuse the fools of their foolery. That made things worse. Liars themselves, they could not conceive of a man speaking truth to his own detriment. My disclaimer was taken for a lie, and they honored me the more for it. And chuckled at the thought of their own perspicacity, that is to say, when what I said was intelligible to them. You see, I used to be a great talker. I have had many experiences. And I used freely to talk of them. It amused and instructed, and I like to amuse and to instruct. You will understand that my voice and my manner of speech did not resemble the voice and the manner of speech of the ruffians with whom I worked and lived. Live as poorly as I would, dress as shabbily as I would, the moment I opened my mouth I was discovered to be different to those people. They perceived it, and I never could disguise my speech. Also, I'm quite sure that they could not understand my speech, follow my argument. I used words which were strange to them to express ideas unimagined by them, while their half-developed minds were more than half occupied, not in listening to me but, in contemplating me. And in trying to form their particular idea of me by the aid of the vulgi sensus imperati, the imperfection of undisciplined senses, at their disposal. I called that imbecility. Perhaps ignorance is the apter term. The malice is to be found among people who ought to know better, people to whom I have told the exact truth about myself, exact at the time of telling, people who being possessed by a desire to think evil, people who read between, instead of on, the lines, people, prone to folly, whom I have not helped to avoid their predilection. I tried to be simple and plain, to sulk, if you like, in my own corner by myself. It was no good. Anyhow, I told no tales of realms or wealth as mine. I made no false pretenses. I myself was grossly deceived, barbarously man-woman and priest-handled. I was foolish to try to explain myself. I was foolish to try to work with, to live with, to equal myself in every respect with, verminous persons within the meaning of the act. I ought to have died. But I did not die. That is all. It is not half. Now you know. Make what you please of it. Tell me, Gentilato instantly said, why did you never go to the Trappists? Because I went to something worse, to something infinitely terribly more ghastly. Trappists live in beautiful silent solitude, they have clean water, beds, regular meals, and peace. I went to live in intellectual silence and solitude in an ugly obscene mob, where clean water was a difficulty, food and a bed an uncertainty. And where I had the inevitable certainty of ceaseless and furious conflict. He hurled the words like javelins, and drew back in his chair. The old bitter feeling of disgust with himself inspired him. He feared lest perhaps he might have seemed to be pleading for sympathy. So he angrily watched to detect any signs of a wish to insult him with sympathy. But he really had gone far, far beyond the realm of human sympathy. There was not a man on the earth who would have dared to risk rebuff, to persist against rebuff. To soar to him with that blessed salve of human sympathy, for which, underneath his armor, and behind his warlike mien, he yearned. Pity perhaps, horror perhaps, dislike perhaps, might have met him. But he only had emphasized his own fastidious aloofness. He had cleared off the mire, but he had disclosed the cold of marble, not the warmth of human flesh. The cardinals remained silent for a minute. Then Ragna said, "An enemy hath done this." "Who is it?" George blazed with vigorous candid delight. "That is the first genuine word which I have had from the heart of your eminency." He returned to his repellent manner. "I gave the names of my calumniators to Cardinal Leighton." Jerry Sant the lib lab, aided by the woman and a clod of worms who had turned, Leighton said to Ragna. "Let them be smothered in the dunghill." "Anathema sint." Ragna growled. Again there was an exposition of silence in the throne room. George was frozen hard and white. Ragna and Leighton continued to look at each other. Carvalle's eyes had the blue brilliance of wet stars. Saviali, Semphil, Talacrin, Whitehead, were as though they had seen the saxificus head of the Medusa. Sterling gazed straight before him, in the manner of the sphinx carven of black basalt. George was watching them with half-shut eyes from the illimitable distance of his psychic altitude. Presently, the pure pale old face of Gentilato and the pure pale young face of Van Christen simultaneously were lifted, and their eyes met his. He blushed, slowly drew out the pontifical ring, and put it on his finger. "Lord Cardinals, it is our will to be alone," the Supreme Pontiff said. They came one by one and kissed his ring. And retired in silence. Chapter 23. When the door was shut, Hadrian remained quite motionless on the throne, and set himself to review what he had said. He wondered whether he for once had got down to and laid bare the root of the matter, whether he for once had made his argument clear and convincing. Good God! Who even could hope to be convincing? He flung the thing away from him, and forever closed that volume of the book of his life. He rose, and went straight into the bedroom. Here he stripped, and stood erect, knees and feet close, gripped a pair of 10-pound dumbbells. And swung them with the alternating gesture of a right and left overhand bowler, rhythmically swaying from the hips. He counted up to 100. And went to another movement, a full round overhead sweep of both arms together, expanding the long-breathing lungs, quickening the pulses, brightening the eyes. His skin became moist and warm. He washed his face and hands in oatmeal water with no soap, and went into the bathroom, turning on the high tap and letting the cold soft water rain down upon him until he was numbed. He quickly dried himself, and put on completely clean clothes, rolling up those which he had discarded and thrusting them into a linen bag. Then, he emerged all flushed and white and fresh. And summoned Sir Eulo to the secret chamber. "And so you are thinking of marriage, Carino," Hadrian said, putting the young man into a chair and bestowing fumificables. Sir Eulo went almost as scarlet as his uniform, his eyes and teeth gleamed. Hadrian handed to him a sheet of paper containing 6 stanzas of passionate expression in rhyme, under the heading Vorrei tu ascoltassi la mia voce. "Don't leave your sonnets about. And don't be so terrified, you silly boy." "Well, is it true?" The lover's face twitched rather. "I love her," he said with an enormous vocal expansion of the middle word. "But I will not to abandon you, Santita," he added with fixed eyes. "Who is she? Is she good? Has she any money?" "She is the little daughter of the dentist." "But good?" "But, yes. But no money," was the categorical reply. "Does she love you?" "Oh, but how she loves me." "How long have you known her?" "Since Christmas, Santita, when the father of that has scaled the my tooths." "Have you spoken to the father of that about that?" "Oh, but not yet, Santita. Nothing of less, he knows. I gave him to know without the word. And he didn't drive you out of the house? But no, for behold me not the assassin of that dentist. Hadrian laughed. Can you describe her? Oh, that I might to describe her to one who is so dear, so wise. Describe her. Is named Evnica. Is example of goodness, of intellectuality. For example, yesterday with the favor of the most holy I make a visit. I am entering the saloon in the manner of cat, softly, softly. Behold, in a book reads the Signorina Evnica, not book of novels, not journal of Don Chisciot. No. I look over her shoulder, reading titles. Behold, Book of Piety entitled Office to the Proximate. Office to the Proximate? What book of piety is that? Sir Iulo repeated the title in Italian. Ah yes, the duty towards our neighbor. Yes, a very good sign in a girl. Go on. Sir Iulo fixed his bright green eyes upon a mental image, and described each point as he observed it, using his gorgeously florid Tuscan idiom. Has a face to make burn Jove, and to return to ram, eagle or bull, and to make scorn to metals old and new. Blonde she has the hair like thread of gold. The cheeks appear like a rose damasked. The mouth and the eyes are worth a treasure. Has looks angelic, divine, but in the effects and all the motions, human, and the her excellencies not have end. She has what they call a good and fine hand, is white like snow of mountains. Is literate, and makes to talk Tuscan, and in life not a flaw can be found. There is not who better to a swan understands me. Does great things, enough facts, little eats, not drinks never in the middle of eating and not at afternoon tea, merenda. More, I say. She is in her proper acts so learned, that all I have in the world, or small or great, I should have given to her pleasure at a stroke. The more beautiful to my day I never saw, none more servicial, none more prudent, nor acts in a girl more courteous and gay. Has Petrarch and Dante in her hand. And, at time and place if I command, she vomits a little sonnet lightly. Girl of all perfect qualities. And holds me in pledge there if mine. Well now, suppose that you marry her, will you be good to her? Oh, that she shall be the my life and the my delight, dressed in velvet, guarded as a queen. For fear that if she goes about too much should not be robbed by some little hypocrite, that she shall live on collops and bread of baker. How amusing you are! Well, marry that paragon, and be good and happy. You must have an apartment in the city for her, you know, and, about your duties here, you can come when you like. You are not dismissed, but John and James will suffice. Understand, boy, you are wanted here, always. I am here always, Santita. No. Go away and marry. The most certain softeners of a man's moral skin, and sweeteners of his blood, are domestic intercourse and a happy marriage and brotherly intercourse with the poor. Always remember that. By the by, what are you going to live on? If I am always a gentleman of Hadrian, I am having a plenty of money. Ah, but you always will not be a gentleman of Hadrian, because Hadrian will not be always, and, when he is not, his successor will say, via, to you. And then I shall do some things. Ah, but what things? Who knows? But I shall do things. Hadrian went to the safe in the bedroom, then to the writing table, and wrote. He came back with some papers in his hand. Attend. Take this note to Plowden by the post office. He will give you 1,000 sterling. That is a marriage gift to you, so that you may get an apartment in the city and marry that little daughter of the dentist. Don't be silly. Listen. What do you know about photography? About photography? But I know to use that Kodak, the gift della sua osservantissima e venerabilissima Santita. And you do it very well. You are one of the few men now alive who perceive the right moment for pressing the button. Understand? I see with eyes. But there is something besides seeing with eyes. There is a mind which ponders and selects. Too much of honor. No. No honor at all, a stated fact. Well now, think of negatives. They are dense in places, clear in places. And, in other places, more or less dense. Understand? Under the negative you put a certain paper, and expose it to light. Light goes through the clear places and stains the paper black. It partly goes through the more or less dense places, and stains the paper gray in various gradations of tint. It fails to go through the dense places and leaves the paper white. There is your photograph, a little black, a little white, and many different grays. Understand? Yes, Santita. Your photograph is an image of the form, the contours, the modeling, the morbidezza, of the object before your lens. It lacks one thing. It has not color. The process has translated color into monochrome. Do you see that? Yes, Santita. Now white means a blend of all colors, and black means the absence of all colors. Then gray should mean some colors, of this quality or that, of this quantity or that, according to the clarity or the density of the gray. Understand? Yes, Santita. Your negative is black and white and many grays. Yes, Santita. Then understand that all colors lie hidden in the black and white and grays of the negative. In the black lie all colors, it produces the positive white. In the white lie no colors, it produces the positive black. In the various grays lie various colors. Why are you jumping about? Keep still and listen, wriggling lizard that you are. What do you want to do? To liberate those poor colors. So does everybody. At least, everybody wants to photograph in colors, so they paint on the backs of the films, and they play the fool with triply colored negatives. Only one man in the world knows that the color already is there, my boy, stored in the black-white-gray negative. And that the black-white-gray ordinary negative will give up its imprisoned colors to him who has the key. Well now, take the second envelope. The key's there, and it's yours. Don't stare like that. There are 3 other things as well, which may be useful. Don't say a word. Read all those papers until you understand them. They're quite simple. Then practice. When you can do the trick, you will want a little help to do it greatly, to make it useful. Get off the floor. Then take the 3rd envelope to Plowden, it's mentioned in the first, and he will give you 2,000 sterling. Don't touch that foot. That will be enough if you are industrious. Now you are trusted, Iulo mio. Be good always, and be kind to everybody. No, don't move. We are going into the gardens with Flavio. You stay here till you feel better. Tlebiel, 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 Hadrian mewed to his delighted and excited and persequent cat. Chapter 24. It was the festival of St. George, protector of the ninefold kingdom. Hadrian noted with pleasure that it was what the Italians call one of his fortunate days. His head was clear, his limbs were supple, his body lithe, he felt young, exuberant, potent. His soul seemed balanced, elevated. His whole poise was one of gentle incisive simplicity. He had that upright rather dominant gait, by no means arrogant, which marks the happy able man. The Sacred College came early in the morning, directly after his Mass, to congratulate him on the anniversary of his pontificature. And Ragna took occasion to whisper that the Northern Emperor left Palazzo Caffarelli for the Quirinale at dawn. Everyone knew what that meant. When, later, Hadrian descended in state to the Sala Regia, he was on the alert. The introducer of sovereigns announced, the ninefold king, the President of the United States of America, the Northern Emperor, the Japanese Emperor, and a posse of subsidiary kings, princes, and sovereign dukes, who came with the world's congratulations. The pontifical paraphernalia lay on the high red throne, but Hadrian stood at its foot to receive his guests. His garb was white, absolutely simple and fresh. And his pose was apostolic, frank and genial. These enormous potentates towered above him in the splendor of their grandeur. And, as Cardinal Carvale, the fantastic dreamer, said to Cardinal Van Christen, they radiated from him as from a source of light. After the ceremony of reception was finished, their majesties, augustitudes, highnesses, and honors, lingered, chatting with the pontifical court. Some of them had a few words with the Supreme Pontiff. The Northern Emperor came and said, "I know that your holiness will felicitate me on a dispatch which I have just received from my brother Prince Henry, who announces that my glorious German navy has taken Kronstadt." Hadrian replied, and added, "Be merciful, Augustitude." William then did a politely ferocious scowl, intended to indicate imperial impatience, and continued in a lower tone, "I am also anxious to assure your holiness that I myself deeply regret the absence of my cousin and imperial brother, Victor Emmanuel. All that I could say has been said to persuade his Augustitude to join me on this auspicious and never to be forgotten occasion. I wish that to be known. It only is a personal obstacle, not a political, which prevents the Southern Emperor from coming here. Most Holy Lord, it is not even a personal obstacle. Victor Emmanuel has the most profound and much to be admired and preeminently well-merited veneration and reverence for your person. It is, well, really it seems almost childish, but he has persuaded himself that the Roman Pontiff owes the King of Italy a visit? Precisely, Holy Father. There is some history of an approach which his Augustitude's royal and martyred father made to the conclave of 1878. And for a mere idea, Victor Emmanuel will continue alienate from us. Yet, ideas are very fine things, to be respected, to be cultivated, in this material age. They are so rare, so singular. And constancy, fidelity to an idea, above all things is singular and rare, in this age of compromise from which the world only now emerges. Victor Emmanuel is not to be blamed, but praised. Suddenly a bright light came in the apostle's eyes. Well, then, the next step is obvious. If the Son will not come to the Father, then the Father must go to the Son. And an impulse to instant movement appeared to urge him onward. The Northern Emperor splendidly rose to the occasion. It would be one more grand deed added to your holiness's many grand deeds. I trust that I may have the never sufficiently to be valued honor of accompanying you. But we walk, said Hadrian. I also will gladly walk, said William. The Pope darted a rapid glance round the hall. The King of Portugal was talking to the Japanese Emperor, and the Basil of the Hellenes was listening to the Prince of Montenegro and New Serbia. The ninefold king, with one arm paternally resting on the shoulder of the young King of Spain, was telling, as his own, an extremely funny story, which he had heard 5 minutes before from Cardinal Semfil, to the President of America. Cardinals and sovereigns clustered round them, plotting with laughter at each admirably detailed jocosity. We can escape this way, the Pope said to the Emperor. Outside the hall, a pontifical page ran for the white three-cornered hat. And the two descended the Scala Regia, with its Ionic columns flanked by pontifical guards, and made their way into the square of St. Peter's. There was a cleared roadway. And they quickly walked between long lines of magnificent Italian soldiery. Rome occupied the sidewalks, and sank to its knees as the Supreme Pontiff, shedding benedictions, went swinging lightly and swiftly by. The German gentleman made no attempt to take salutes until Hadrian said, "Oh, do notice these dear Romans. They will be pleased. And you know that you profoundly admire the Bersaglieri." The Emperor responded, "I am as proud to salute the Romans as I am to salute the noblest Roman of them all, to use the words of your holiness's divine Shakespeare." And he strode on, saluting, while the pontiff blessed. As they passed the Palazzo Venezia, Hadrian said, "Victor Emmanuel really behaves extremely well. 3/4 of his army are in the field. And here is a parcel of foreign sovereigns practically occupying his capital no, not homage, in courtesy to us. And also out of respect, holiness. out of respect then and courtesy to our apostolature. It is no affair of his, and yet he lines the streets with troops, while he himself, oh, it's really very decent of him. Victor Emmanuel is a truly great man, the emperor commented. The Pope assented. They entered the palace of the Quirinali, and went straight through the ambassador's hall to the southern emperor's study. William remained in the antechamber. Victor Emmanuel in a light grey flannel suit was reading proofs of his numismatic catalogue. He stood up pale and stiff, when his groom of the chambers came in and whispered a word. Hadrian followed on the instant, entering with candid gentle dignity, extending an English hand. Not a word was said. Victor Emmanuel, shining with the light of the purple which he had not yet worn, took the outstretched hand, held it, felt his own gripped and held. He bent his head, then his knee. Reconciliation was complete. "May I have the honor and the happiness of presenting my wife to your holiness?" he said, a minute later. He went along the corridor and gave 2 raps on a further door. "Darling," he cried, "please come." The exquisite Empress Elena appeared. She started slightly at first, but bravely came on, imperially mysteriously pale and radiant as the chorus of nightly stars and the bright powers which bring summer and winter to mortals. Conspicuous in the firmament. Hadrian at once won her with, and the lovely children. "Oh yes, the kiddies," Victor Emmanuel said. "Do you know that we owe one immense emotion to your boy?" And Hadrian narrated the incident in Prince Attendelo's garden. Mother and father proudly laughed. "Yes, we heard about that, of course. And I wondered what would happen if ever we ourselves should meet your holiness by accident, as the children did," the empress said. "Well, we have met, and now your Augustitudes know," laughed Hadrian. "Filiberto is a queer little chap," Victor Emmanuel continued, "he says the most extraordinary things. Came running into the stables the other morning crying because some dog had barked and startled him. 'Stamp at M,' I said, and after all, you can run faster than a dog," said I to hearten him. "Yes," says he, "but you see, father, when I do run, I'm always putting out one leg at the back for the dog to bite." "But I can tell you something better than that," the empress put in. "He was a bad boy in the chapel at benediction on Sunday. I'm afraid, holiness, that this is rather a naughty story." "Tell it instantly and relieve your sinful soul, daughter," the haughty pontiff commanded. How the 3 roared. She continued, "He persisted in trying to balance a pile of prayer books on the ledge of his chairback. And every now and then they came down with a crash. At last I took him on my knee. And told him that the holy angels were looking at him, and that they would go and tell the Lord God what a wicked little ruffian he was. And then he said, dirty little sneaks. Oh, the exquisite boy!" Hadrian shouted with laughter. "Well, I'll go and fetch him," said the southern emperor, running out of the door, just as the northern emperor came in by the other, prepared to play the part of peacemaker. That, now, was not necessary. And England, Germany, and Italy, chattered like children till the children came. Their father did not return. His men were having a bad time, trying to beat the record for getting a sovereign into his habit of ceremony. The fair Prince Filiberto solemnly approached the Pope. "Are you the white father which formerly I have seen in somebody's forest?" "Yes," said Hadrian. "Are you quite good now?" the boy continued, with great black basilic eyes. "No," said Hadrian, feeling the horror of the end of youth confronted with the flower of innocence. "Are you truly contrite for having been a naughty boy? No, man, I mean?" "Yes," said Hadrian. "Are you sitting on my father's sofa because he has forgiven you?" "Yes," said Hadrian, thinking what a frightful old fool he must appear. "I liked you when I saw you in that forest. And I like you now, but mother told me that the white father was not my father's friend." "Mother made a mistake, little son," said the empress, leaning forward in sudden confusion. "The white father is father's best friend." "Oh, how I am glad for that, because now you can be also my friend." The prince cried, scattering his deliberate English to the 4 quarters of the globe. "Most willingly," said Hadrian, taking the rose-brown hand, and drawing the child towards him. Innocence put up its pretty lips. The apostle lost one breath, and stooped and kissed the stainless brow. Then he turned to greet the girls. "This child once asked my husband a very awkward question," the mother said, presenting the Princess Yolanda. "The King of England was coming here. And Victor was showing her His Majesty's incoronation portrait. Ah, but how she admired it! And she said, 'Father, why don't you wear a hat like that king?'" The Supreme Pontiff looked at the blushing child. "You would not call it a hat, Princess, now that you are grown up?" "No, Papa Inglese, a crown." "You would like your father to have a crown? Tell him that there are 2 waiting for him, one at Monza, and another in the Lateran." The Roman emperors escorted the Pope returning to Vatican. On the way, carriages met them, and disgorged sovereigns, state coaches met them, and emitted cardinals, courtiers alighted from horseback and emerged from motorcars. The return became a procession of the powers, led by the power of the keys. They had crossed the Ponte Sant'Angelo, and were about to turn to the left by the castle, when a disheveled man in black contrived to break out from the ranks of the people. He got through the Bersaglieri and stepped into the middle of the road, pointed a revolver at Hadrian, and fired. The bullet struck His Holiness high up on the left breast, piercing the pulmonary artery just above the lung. The slim white figure stopped, wavered, and sank down. The whole world seemed to stand still, while the human race gasped once. A frantic woman in a fox-colored wig pitched out of the opposite crowd, and groveled. "Love, love," she howled hideously, "oh, and I loved him so. Oh! Oh! I really did love him. Yes, I did, I did, I did, I did," she yelped to the sun in the firmament of heaven. The discord resembled the baying of a dog which breaks the cadence of Handel's Largo on arch lutes. God's vicegerent moved, looked at her from a distance, gently, even curiously. "Daughter, go in peace," he said, and turned away. She remained there groveling, longing to touch him, forlorn, gorgonized. The Roman emperors also kneeled to right and left, fiercely looking among their aides for the help which did not come, which could not come, from man. The assassin was in 100 tearing hands. Screeches shot out of his gullet when they silently and inevitably began to tear him to pieces. Roman knives flashed over the parapet and slid into Tiber. Hooked hands, like the curving talons of griffins, were the weapons for this work. But the Supreme Pontiff beckoned him. And the gesture was unmistakable, universally authoritative. Shaken and violently shaking, jagged, lacerated, a disreputable wreck of Pictish ready-made tailoring, Jerry Sant staggered forward, staggered like one fascinated. Cardinals and sovereigns drew away from him, and the mob hemmed him in. "For they know not," the apostle raised himself a little, supported by imperial hands. How bright the sunlight was, on the warm grey stones, on the ripe Roman skins, on vermilion and lavender and blue and ermine and green and gold, on the indecent grotesque blackness of 2 blotches. On apostolic whiteness and the rose of blood. "Augustitudes, our will and pleasure is." "Speak it, most holy Father." "Augustitudes, we name you both the ministers of this our will." And to the murderer he said, "Son, you are forgiven, you are free." Down Borgo Nuovo came guards, chamberlains, curial prelates, cardinals, from Vatican. The English and American cardinals took their vermilion on their arms, and ran like lithe long-limbed schoolboys. The faithful young Sir John outran them all. He kneeled to Hadrian, who said, "Dear John, take this cross," and Flavio. The Southern Emperor unclasped the chain and rosy pectoral cross, and handed them to the gentleman of the apostolic chamber, who took them and fainted away. Out of Santo Spirito came one with the stalks of sacred chrism. Cardinals Van Christen and Carvale, panting, kneeled before the ruler of the world. Percy drew out the hidden pontifical pyx, took the sacred host therefrom, and held it. "The profession of faith, most holy Lord," he bravely whispered. "I believe all that which Holy Mother Church believes. I ask pardon of all men. Dear Jesus, be not to me a judge but a Saviour." Cardinal Sterling gravely intoned the commendation of a Christian soul. The splendid company of angels, the senate of apostles, the army of white-robed martyrs, the lilied squadron of shining confessors, the chorus of joyful maids, patriarchs, hermits. Stephen and Lawrence, Sylvester and Gregory, Francis and Lucy and Mary Magdalene, Mary, God's own mother. All the saints of God who daily are invited to attend the passing of the poorest Christian soul, were invoked for the Father of princes and kings. "And mild and cheerful may the aspect of Christ Jesus seem to thee," the singer's voice failed. Cardinal Carvale went on with no interval, imparted absolution, and the sacrament of the dying. Saints of God advanced to help him, angels of the Lord come to meet him, receiving his soul, offering it in the sight of the Most High. The splendor of mortal words reverberated from the ancient fortress wall, in the great silence of immortal Rome. When the earthly vicar of Jesus Christ had received extreme unction and viaticum, when he had done for him all that which Christ's church can do, he required to be lifted on his feet. The Roman emperors rose, raising him. The vehement ferocity of their aspect terribly contrasted with their tender movement. The torments of powerless power, of intimidation inflicted in the supreme moment of exultation, rent these grand strong men, and graced them. The bloodstain streamed down the Pope's white robes with the red stole of universal jurisdiction. The slender hand with the two huge rings ascended. The shy brown eyes fluttered. And were wide, and very glad. Then the tired young voice rang like a quiet bell. "May God omnipotent, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, bless you." It was the apostolic benediction of the city and the world. The hand and the dark eyelashes drooped, and fell. The delicate fastidious lips closed, in the ineffable smile of the dead who have found out the secret of love, and are perfectly satisfied. So died Hadrian the Seventh, bishop, servant of the servants of God, and, some say, martyr. So died Peter in the arms of Caesar. The world sobbed, sighed, wiped its mouth, and experienced extreme relief. The College of Cardinals summed him up in the brilliant epigram of Tacitus. Capax imperii nisi impericit. He would have been an ideal ruler if he had not ruled. Religious people said that he was an incomprehensible creature. And the man on the motor said that the pace certainly had been rather rapid. Pray for the repose of his soul. He was so tired. Feliciter.